KZSU-FM Stanford, welcome to another edition of Hearsay Culture. My name is Dave Levine. I'm an associate dean at Elon University School of Law, as well as an affiliate scholar at Stanford Center for Internet and Society, the University of North Carolina Center for Information Technology and Public Life, and the University of Milan's Information Society Law Center. Today, I'm very excited to have on the show technologist Robin Berjon, who has written extensively in the space of protocols around how the internet operates, but more recently, how we think about the broad technological infrastructure that we have in the world and how we might regulate it and build it for social good. This is a topic which, of course, is extremely timely as we're recording on January 16th, 2025, because we are in the midst of a worldwide cataclysm around social media. Facebook, very recently here in the United States, where I'm recording, although Robin is at his home in Belgium, has decided to remove fact-checking from their, such as it was, from their platform in favor of a Twitter or X-like community standards operation, which has drawn criticism not only from members of the former Twitter staff, but also the community. The community, which is connected, of course, to the political machinations and pays close attention to those machinations of Elon Musk, has migrated to some degree to a new platform, Bluesky. Bluesky, which most recently has over 26 million subscribers, has more or less grown exponentially from its launch in 2023, where I was an early adopter and then candidly quickly abandoned it because, to put it simply, no one was there. I promoted Hearsay Culture. I put up all kinds of social media there to promote our show, and I was getting no reaction. Now, you might say, Levine, you got no reaction because your content needed to be better. I don't think that's the case. Maybe you needed a marketer. That's absolutely true. But what clearly was the case is that people weren't there. We also saw that happen to a larger degree on the site Mastodon, which was also supposed to be an alternative, which still exists, but has not had the currency that Bluesky has. Bluesky's benefited, of course, because of various factors that tend to have driven people away from not only X, but now perhaps Facebook. And much as we've seen other applications take advantage of certain cataclysms in society, there was a website for a long time that focused during COVID on audio forms of social media that didn't do very well and has declined, although it still exists. And now we see Bluesky in this space. I mention all of this because Robin's work over a period of at least 10 years and really more like 15 or perhaps 20 has been at the center of these kinds of issues. And so this conversation is particularly timely. We're going to be discussing infrastructure as well as a new project on which Robin is a founding member called Free Our Feeds that launched this week on January 13th, 2025, that aims to address how social media can operate away from, as they put it, billionaire control, and how we might have a more holistic and user-driven experience around social media, something that people have longed for in a lot of ways, but has diminished on really all of the social media platforms, primarily, although we're going to talk about it, because of the need to have sustainable business models. But also beyond that, the search for profits. Robin, as he defines himself, is a technologist. He has a background in computer science, but technology and technological policy is really the focus. He has been involved heavily in data governance, both at the W3C Foundation, and then more recently, he spent several years at the New York Times, where he worked on advancing privacy and imagining a capture-resistant future of the web. Robin is joining us via video, and we're going to talk about a very interesting New York Times Magazine cover that sits behind him, which drew my attention, as it might anyone who sees this video. He's currently the deputy director of the IPFS Foundation, where he works on next generation web architecture. He is a prolific writer, and I've known his work for quite a while, but I came across his work again in my work on trade secrecy and public infrastructure and how we think about technology and access to information. I'm very excited to have him joining us today on January 16, 2025 via Zoom. Robin, thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. I'm delighted to be here.
So, Robin, let's start off. I want to start off very big picture. And it's going to sound very weedy for people that aren't in the academic world, but we're talking big picture about infrastructure before we talk about social media.
Right.
When people think about infrastructure, they tend to think about bridges and roads, which are infrastructure, but technological infrastructure is something different. What is that, and how does social media, broadly speaking, fit into our understanding of technological infrastructure?
That's a very good question, and you're entirely right. When you bring up the word infrastructure, people imagine, dams and roads and, massive things that are huge in the landscape that you can touch. And if you start talking about digital or technological infrastructure, the thing that people imagine is, maybe data centers, maybe connectivity and like wires that connect various data centers and people. But actually, if you take a step back and reach a more conceptual definition of infrastructure based on what it does in society, based on its role and its structure, and you use that definition to look at the digital world, then you reach a completely different conclusion. And so essentially, we can think of infrastructure as something that has three primary properties. First, it's really big and hard to replace. Sometimes because of scale, sometimes because of network effects. But basically, it's something that you can't just like easily make a second of in order to replace one that might be defective or the workings of which you don't like. Second, um, infrastructure has to support multiple different uses. It's not something that's for one single purpose. It really is, as Brett Frischman often puts it, shared means to many ends. And so you want a great diversity of users of whatever infrastructure it is. And if you think of roads, that's certainly true, right? You can use them for freight, you can use them for tourism, you can use them with trucks or cars or bicycles, what have you, right? And then third, there has to be a risk for the operator of that infrastructure, whoever owns it, whoever governs it, to be able to control the behavior of the users of the infrastructure. And if you put these three things together, like scale, diversity of downstream users, and the risk of control, you get a way of identifying infrastructure wherever it shows up. And in the digital world, if you start looking at things, there's quite a lot of it. Search is infrastructure, social, browsers, operating system, advertising networks. There's a whole world of digital infrastructure out there. And the problem is, so long as we keep thinking about these things in terms of consumer goods rather than infrastructure, we're not in the right framing to govern them properly, to regulate them properly, to understand how they should be working for us as a society.
So this has been an area that has been a big focus on hearsay culture. I mean, within the last year, I had Victor Mayer Schomburger on discussing his book with Urs Gasser, Guardrails. Shannon Valor was on in her book AI Mirror, which I think Victor and Urs's book is also brilliant. But Shannon's book, AI Mirror. There's a lot of discussion of regulation around technology, and of course we have a prior to the internet, right? We've got, arguably 200 years at least, right, of regulation of technology. And I don't know if you want to go back to the wheel, we've been regulating technology for quite a while. But folks, we don't have to start with the wheel on this, although it would be interesting. But I'll skip the wheel for the moment and focus on computer technology and computer infrastructure. You mentioned Brett Frischman's work, and Brett was an early guest on the show. And as people who are familiar with the field know, Brett was highly influential in establishing the idea of infrastructure and thinking in these spaces, building on, and this is my point, building on, broader ideas of the commons, right? And the ideas of shared resources, which of course also goes back, in Europe, right, for millennia. How is this concept of the commons or shared resources, to which you've referred, a primary motivator and way to think about regulation of, now we're going to talk about it, right? Social media and AI and the other technologies that we're currently approaching.
Right. So one difficulty that we tend to face collectively when we try to discuss these things is that over time the idea of what is public has sort of merged with the idea of government and the state. We've forgotten the idea that they can be public things that are not necessarily state operated. And for something to be public, again, returning to Brett's definition of shared means to many ends, I think that is itself like pretty much, a definition that points directly to something that is public. It is shared. The shared means that we share them together as a public. And so, if you start to think of public in this broad sense, then yes, you immediately approach the problem from a commons essentially perspective. And what's interesting here is that unlike the sort of like hype around the commons that we had 20 years ago on the internet, when everyone was like, oh, everything's free, therefore it's a commons. I think we have a sharper understanding of what approaching infrastructure as a commons means, and that entails forms of governance that are much more involved and in which stakeholders necessarily have a say in how the infrastructure works. And I think again, I keep referring to Brett Frischman's work because it is, as you pointed out, excellent and very defining in this space. But I think one of the things that he pointed out very early in this process is that when you have infrastructure, because it is shared and because it is for many different users, you can't have it optimized for one single purpose. If you start having infrastructure optimized for one single purpose, then you end up with infrastructure that constrains what people can do with it, that very much limits the creativity that could be running wild in society. And therefore, you end up with a system that tends to break the ability of society to solve new problems, to cooperate on new things. And so it tends to be anti-cooperative the moment that you use infrastructure to shape things so much. And I'm talking in abstractions,
Right.
but I think that's something that we see very, very clearly with digital infrastructure. So with social media that is entirely optimized in one direction, with search that only recognizes the relevance of whatever Google has decided is relevant, et cetera, et cetera.
And by the way, I should note, and Brett doesn't quite know this yet, so it'll be funny when he hears this. But I intend to have Brett on the show next week, not coincidentally, to discuss his work and more recent work in this space, because it is so influential. So this is, in a sense, a Brett Frischman fan club of sorts, but I recommend his work across the board. So it brings me to a couple other big points here, right? You have written recently in tandem with this issue about infrastructure shock. And I think it's important as well to understand that concept. It's not just that we have so many new technologies that are coming online at the same time. I mean, generative AI is obviously huge, but social media, relatively speaking, is new. But then we also have new ways that people are using technology, and of course, apps are coming out on a minute-to-minute basis. Describe a little bit what you mean by infrastructure shock from a regulation and how do we deal with it perspective.
Right. So, with the basically, if you go about 100, 150 years, we've progressively over time learned how to govern infrastructure, but we did it essentially, infrastructure component by infrastructure component. So we started having, collective sewers, and we learned how to govern that. And then we started having sources of clean water, and we learned how to govern that. And same with roads, and same with the electricity grid. But it all happened, in a relatively staged manner. There were some bumps, there's all the thinking about like utilities, particularly in the US, 100 and change years ago. But essentially, we had time to see this coming. Now, with the emergence of the internet, what happened is because any service you build connects people and can easily be shipped and scaled up, we ended up with a lot of new infrastructure happening all at once. And the thing is, because so much of it happened at once, because we had forgotten about the debates about utilities from over 100 years ago. I mean, not entirely forgotten, but they definitely didn't it definitely didn't dominate public discourse. Um, and because so much of it happened at once, we didn't react in the way that infrastructure demands, and we didn't set up the governance for it. The thing is, like, infrastructure is not something that you can just regulate at a distance and hope it'll work itself out. Again, because it's shared means, it means that you will have like multiple people involved in, invested in what the infrastructure does. And, anytime you have some shared resource, you will have conflicts that need to resolve. And because it is to many ends, again, there has to be some flexibility as to how it is used. And that means there will be things that might be considered abusive or things that will be debated. And that means that any kind of infrastructure has to be actively governed. You can't at a distance say, yeah, water must be clean, sort it out. Or, electricity has to work, whatever, to make it work. You have to actively, proactively work on it and govern it. And because all this infrastructure happened at once and we didn't set up the governance capacity, the institutional capacity to manage it collectively, it created a shock for society such that all of a sudden the internet became the infrastructure of infrastructure itself. Like even physical infrastructure today is influenced or operates on internet systems. And we have this mass of infrastructural systems that instead of being publicly governed are essentially all of them, pretty much almost all of them, owned by billionaires and or monopolies, and governed in that way. And as a result, it's almost unsurprising. I wish we'd figured that out 20 years ago, but it's almost unsurprising to see the autocratic movement emerging from it because it is governed as an autocratic system.
Well, and it's also, as you just alluded to, right? It's private infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
It's built by companies whose reason for being is profit making, which of course is the nature of the corporation. There's not only is there nothing wrong with that, although we could debate, profit making and so forth. It is the purpose of a corporation. It's Hornbook law in the U.S. and the EU and anywhere where you have private companies that they serve shareholders, they serve their owners, and they're supposed to make profits or they don't exist. I have written for over 20 years on the problem of private ownership of public infrastructure, and it seems like that is a gigantic issue, and one which is important. Now, my question though is a little bit different, which is it's not necessarily bad or problematic that we have private infrastructure. We've also had private infrastructure in a variety of places for years, right? AT&T in the United States, right, is a private company and has been. The EU, of course, has similar examples of it. There are private roads, both in Europe as well as in Australia. Early on, building private roads. So it's not that something is private or even profit making that creates the issue. It seems like the issue is more, as you've already alluded to, about the priorities or about what is the first and overarching goal. Am I right about that, or is it more complex?
Absolutely no. I mean, of course, it can always get more
Yeah,
complex. We can
yeah.
always make
I
things,
mean, fundamentally, is that
but
what it is? Yeah.
fundamentally, you're entirely right. I think the problem is not private ownership or private operation. The problem is private governance. Basically, if you think in terms of what capture means in a society, it's the seizing of public means for private ends. And as we've established earlier, because infrastructure is by its very nature a shared means, it's by its very nature a public good. It has to be a form of public good. And therefore, it needs public governance. Now, it can be privately owned, it can be privately operated, but it needs to be in a space in which the public has a very direct say over how it operates. Now, you can limit the amount of work that the public has to put into governing it by enforcing neutrality rules. Essentially, if you have neutrality rules on your infrastructure, it means it limits how much the infrastructure a provider can optimize for a very specific end. Therefore, it limits capture, and that means that the public governance can be relatively limited. Largely to do with oversight and with updating it. Updating our approach to neutrality over time. However, none of these systems, in the digital space, are under any kind of public governance. They are all privately governed, and that is where capture happens, because that private governance leads these public systems to be used for private ends.
Which I think brings us to this fascinating new project, which is launched this week, Free Our Feeds. Now, I should say to listeners that when I was doing research on Free Our Feeds, I slightly mistyped Free Our Feeds, and I came across Free the Feed, which is an advocacy organization around encouraging breastfeeding. This is not Free Our Feeds. And as someone that teaches trademark law, I found that interesting. But right, Free Our Feeds makes a lot of sense because obviously feed can refer to breastfeeding, but it also obviously in this case refers to our social media feed. Now, your project, which is at freeourfeeds.com, its tagline is Save Social Media from Billionaire Capture. Save social media from billionaire capture. Let's talk a little bit about this project. The project is fascinating, and it's got a terrific group, including yourself, who are advising and consulting on it. Among them, people who Hearsay Culture listeners would be very familiar with, like Nabiha Syed, who is now at Mozilla, but has been at other groundbreaking organizations. Of course, also Eli Pariser, whose work has been incredibly influential, and others. I mean, it's a terrific group. There's a social public letter that has been put out that is, co-signed by Jimmy Wales and the actor Mark Ruffalo. So, I mean, you've got people who have prominence both on the substantive side of what the work is, but also prominence in terms of leadership and in different industries. But let's focus here. What is ultimately Free Our Feeds about? And importantly, how does it tie to the emergence of Bluesky as a social media company, and at least at this point, viewed in part as an alternative to X/Twitter and maybe now to Facebook?
Right. So essentially, if you look at Bluesky, the way it's built, underlying Bluesky is something called the AT protocol, which is essentially, a protocol similar to other existing protocols that we routinely ignore as users, but things like HTTP and so forth. And what this means is that what Bluesky has built is not just, a sort of Twitter-like system that is a product, that is their own server, etc., but they've built a much broader system that can enable people to create their own, other social media apps that might reproduce, I don't know, Instagram or TikTok, or invent entirely new social modalities. So that's one thing. But also it means that even within the Bluesky world, other people can write their own Bluesky clients, can interact with Bluesky content, can take their content and their followers off of Bluesky server and outside of their control to other providers or to their own provided infrastructure. And so there's a lot of promise in that Bluesky system and in the AT protocol that underlies it. However, even if you make something open, even if you make something that potentially supports decentralization, but you have in that ecosystem one large player that is 98% of users and almost all the content, then you don't really have, you have the freedom in theory, you have the alternatives in theory, but you don't have practical alternatives. And so what we're doing with Free Our Feeds is raising funds to establish a foundation that will also operate at protocol infrastructure, and that will encourage development of new systems on top of the AT protocol so as to create countervailing power to Bluesky itself. And it's not hostile against Bluesky. I mean, they themselves have been very clear that they know that they are venture capital backed, and therefore at some point, their shareholders might require that they do things that their own community doesn't like, as has happened with almost every other social media company. And therefore they welcome this sort of loyal opposition, or friendly pressure to keep the protocol open and to keep the entire system open. And this ties to what we were saying earlier about infrastructure. Essentially, what we're doing is we're approaching this underlying layer of social media as shared public infrastructure, and we want to make sure that it is operated as such and stays operated as such. And so those are the broad goals of the Free Our Feeds project.
We're chatting with Robin Berjon on KZSU-FM Stanford and Hearsay Culture. Robin, so so I can imagine listeners hearing this and saying, "Okay, when does the Free Our Feeds Foundation get captured itself?" Right? Because we've seen this issue come up over and over again. Bluesky already has said they, and I'm paraphrasing, but they've made the point that they intend to be, quote, billionaire proof. And certainly the board, and the founding people of Bluesky include people like Mike Masnick, who's also been on Hearsay Culture, who many Hearsay Culture listeners will be familiar with, right? The founder of Tech Dirt. And, anyone that's read Mike Masnick's work, right, and advocacy over 20 years, right, would say, well, there's no way that Mike Masnick is going to allow Bluesky to become captured by a billionaire and to, prevent users from having the feed that they want. And other commentators have said, maybe they've called themselves cynical, or they've called themselves realists and said, well, it's just a matter of time. So I want to ask you a little bit more about the backing of the foundation itself, because you've got seriously, a terrific group of experts and people that are journalists. I mean, Cory Doctorow is involved. I mean, people who are highly regarded. Why should listeners take at face value? Maybe they shouldn't take it at face value, but why should people believe, is probably a better way to put it, that the foundation itself, because of, and let's be clear, right, the amount of money that can be made through this technology, right, is not just going to be, maybe not this year, but in a year or two, just another way to support the capture on which you have been founded. And by the way, I'll throw into it, just to pile on this question, OpenAI, which also started with similar values and is no longer, ironically, open.
Yeah, that's a very good and a very salient question. I think one thing you said in there, I think, is the key to answering this, is you said it's only a matter of time. And the thing is, like, there is no permanent protection against capture, right? Capture resistance is exactly, in my mind, like cybersecurity. It's something where you have to constantly be on the defensive and constantly figure out ways of renewing your protection and looking out for new threats. And essentially, this is what we have to be doing here as well, right? In the same way that if someone came to you and said, "Oh, your computer, your server is 100% secure and it's 100% secure forever," you would know that they're a bad security person, right? You should absolutely not deal with any cybersecurity expert who would make that kind of claim. And same thing, if I told you that this foundation happened to be, capture resistant forever, and it's 100% capture proof now and will stay that way forever, you really shouldn't trust me. You shouldn't trust me as a governance person. What I can say, however, is if you look at the list of people involved and the list of backers that we have now, then I believe, at least that's my perspective, you challenge it, people should challenge it. But like, I believe that we have credibility that we can be capture resistant for a certain amount of time. I hope years. I would say, finger in the wind, 3 years, a few years, right? The goal is, once we raise money, to use that and deploy that as fast as possible to create a capture resistant ecosystem, so that you don't have to trust us. You have the ability to trust the ecosystem itself. The way that works is by encouraging as many independent entities to emerge as possible. Some of them commercial, so like, for instance, new social media systems operating on the shared ad protocol that will have different different objectives from one another, so that they push and pull each other into good governance, but also like some non-profit structures, etc. We really need to encourage the appearance of an ecosystem of forms of governance, forms of interest, and that have a shared interest in maintaining this coherent system. The technical the technical word for that is polycentricity. I generally try to avoid using it because like people run away screaming
I was about
when
to say, I hope people haven't stopped listening at this point, but yes, but I understand. But what does that mean for seriously? For
right.
yeah,
I mean, in a sense, it's like the joke that editors have that the readership of your book halves for every equation that you put in it. Like it's sort of similar with the governance terms where they tend to be so horrific and long that people run away. However, um, polycentricity is basically when you have a great diversity of institutions at multiple levels and multiple scales. And so you can think of it as, basically you have your own town, that's one governance level, and it might be embedded in a county, in a state, in a country, etc. And all of these, and it also has laterally other cities, maybe communities of cities, and usually these don't have clear boundaries. They will be stepping on each other's toes, and that helps. And all kinds of institutions happen in that city, around that city, above that city, etc. And what happens is that when you have a failure at one system, the levels above and below can help shore it up, right? So, for instance, um, if a state, to take like a US-based example, if a state has started having failed governance, then maybe its cities or its counties would start pushing back or would provide some kind of countervailing power. Or on the other side, maybe the federal government would like push back on some, on some excesses. And what you want is basically this permanent tussle. You don't want anyone to have final authority over anything. You
right.
want people to be able to push back, institutions to push back against one another. This sounds complicated, it sounds messy, and there's a reason for that. Is because democratic systems are always messy, and they're supposed to be messy. They can't work if they're not messy. Um, and so essentially, that is how the real world work. A lot of the time, we don't think about it this way. At least people who don't do political science or institutional studies don't think about it this way. They tend to have a very clean idea of like, institutional boundaries and responsibilities and a hierarchy of power. But in truth, the real world works that way. Online, we don't have that, or we don't have enough of that. We don't have enough redundancy in institutions that are able to, again, create this messy system where they push back against each other or keep, checks and balances on one another. And really, to return to the initial question about the capture resistance of free R feeds, we're not going to be capture resistant forever, but we can foster a capture resistant ecosystem.
Well, and it's public in a sense ownership of the protocol itself, which seems to be at the center of it, right? To the extent that the protocol itself is controlled, right, by intellectual property law or is otherwise owned, right? That's where you start having those issues. And of course, going back to the beginning of our discussion, that's what the purpose of the commons is, right? Is to prevent that kind of ownership of the foundational spaces that allow for communication, which is what I want to pick up after I say, coincidentally, that KZSU is a nonprofit, which I also want to talk about, non-commercial radio station at Stanford University that, wait for it, listeners of Hearsay Culture, but you've heard me say this over 300 times at least, right? Requires donations from listeners like you to continue its diverse programming. Now, I should say, in light of the, speaking of infrastructure, right, I'm not intimately involved at how Stanford, manages, broadly speaking, KZSU, but, KZSU's certainly facilities are provided by Stanford University. It's on the Stanford campus, but at the same time, it operates independently at that level, in part, by the way, because of the speech issues, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But if you want to make a donation, you can email us at kzsu.stanford.edu. Of course, I encourage you to continue to listen to KZSU, and because of its Again, so apropos of our discussion, diverse programming. And also tune in and check out the Hearsay Culture Network with my friend Denise Howell for our different shows that we have going, including Uneven Distribution and R&D with D&D. So I want to come back here to what I think is at the center of this, and certainly it's at the center of your project, which is this private, but more specifically, billionaire control. And behind you, for those of you that aren't watching the video, although you might be now that we're on YouTube, but if you're listening on KZSU, I'm going to describe this, but I want you to talk about it. Behind Robin in his office is a New York Times Magazine cover. And it's one that, by the way, as an avid reader of the New York Times, I think I wasn't getting the paper edition when this came out, so I never actually saw this cover. And I will express abject jealousy that you have this, Robin, and I don't have the kind of money to ask you to part with this, and I don't think you should. But what it is, for those that don't see it, it's a cover of the magazine. It has what is clearly a rather harried cat who appears cartoonishly like the cat has just stepped on a live wire, and under it, it says, so, and actually there's some books blocking it, Robin, so you might just want to finish it. It says, thank you. It says, so the internet didn't turn out the way we hoped. So the internet didn't turn out the way we hoped. Terrific cover and fantastic for a variety of reasons. I don't want to talk about it, but I want to key in on something. You worked at the New York Times for several years, and as many people know, right, the media infrastructure has directly confronted this issue of billionaire control, and the billionaires are in a sense very much like U.S. robber barons or benevolent dictators, in the sense that the New York Times isn't billionaire controlled in that sense, but the Washington Post at this point obviously is owned by Jeff Bezos, and I'm going to use that as an example. And you're no longer with the New York Times, so so I think hopefully it's more comfortable discussing it. But the point is this, right? Take the Washington Post by way of example. The Washington Post was suffering financially, amazingly, right? As all media companies are, right? Literally, to more or less. And while Jeff Bezos has interfered directly with the editorial and information creating process directly, and it's not disputed, at least in any meaningful way, in preventing the Washington Post editorial board from putting out apparently what would have been an endorsement of Kamala Harris in the U.S. election, right? It's Jeff Bezos also that in many ways, because of money, right, allows the Washington Post to continue to operate. And so you've got this major problem in, and we're talking about journalism, right? Throughout the globe, where money needs to be had somewhere. And if it's not going to come from subscribers, and advertising is being hoovered up by platforms primarily and so forth, right? It's got to come from somewhere. Is that a proper way to think about before we talk about the solutions, which I want to get to, right? Before we talk about those, is that a proper way to think about not just, and I'm asking about your experience in journalism, but also the problem we have ultimately in having a Bluesky, for example, that's going to be, as it is right now, ad-free and user curated. And although it is still trade secret operated, although the protocol is open, we don't know everything about how Bluesky is operating, although it's certainly more transparent than other companies are. But is that a proper analogy for the challenges we face, the challenges that journalism has faced?
I mean, yes, I think that's a great frame to look at the problem of infrastructure capture in general, and how difficult it is to create, public service valuable goods on top of captured infrastructure. One thing that is a pet peeve of mine that people keep saying is that we haven't found the business model for online journalism. That's not true at all. We have, like, online journalism makes a lot of money. The problem is most of that money is actually captured by big tech companies. So if you look at advertising, it's incredible. It's something like 50 to 80% of ad revenue it doesn't go to the publisher. It goes directly to an intermediary, usually Google, sometimes Facebook, one of the big ones, right? Same thing in subscriptions. Like if your subscription goes through the App Store or something like that, you're talking about 15 to 30% taxation from the platform for what? For very little in terms of service and exchange, right? And so this happens at every single level. And it's not just the taxation, like obviously any business would struggle under like, 50, 80, 30, 50, 80% taxation. That is a huge tax load, and it's entirely privatized, right? It's private taxation by big tech companies. Any business would struggle with that. But on top of that, there's also all the free labor that journalistic organizations have to provide, right? They have to keep changing how they produce content. They have to make the sources available to those big tech things. So if you want to be on Apple News, you need to support the Apple News format. If you want to be on app, you need to support the app format. You need to be active on social, etc., etc., etc. Basically, you have to buy ads to drive traffic to your own thing so that you can then make money with ads there as well. And so overall, if you remove, that requirement to have free labor and that insane level of private taxation on journalistic outlets, a lot of them would become profitable overnight. It wouldn't be a problem, right? However, this is not happening. This is not something that has happened, and that is why they are all of these outlets are being, one after the other, either collapsing or purchased by billionaires who can, sort of like bankroll them and then control what they say.
Yeah.
It is a similar problem that we face with other types of public interest infrastructure, in that we need to find a sustainability model, and that sustainability model shouldn't be captured by big tech, as happened with journalism. I think we can do that. I think no one wants to talk about advertising because everyone hates it, but I do think we can operate a public interest advertising network based on different principles. And again, if we treat it like infrastructure, in my mind, it's the same thing as sewage, right? No one wants to think about sewage, but you're very happy when you flush the toilet and it works. Advertising should work in the same way, right? No one wants to do advertising. No one wants to think about it. However, when you can consult something and not have to pay for it, it's a pretty serious benefit. And having worked for several years for a subscription-based, the organization, the New York Times, subscriptions aren't a solution to this problem because they are too expensive for most people. And if we don't want to create a two-tier system in which only the rich have access to quality information, we need something such that public interest journalism can be distributed. And yes, if, donation supported networks are good, but it's probably not enough. There's probably not enough philanthropy to support all of it in the world, and therefore we do need to be talking about advertising. And I really hope that as we ramp up this free art feeds initiative, we can invest some time and some money into figuring out what a privacy friendly, ethical, etc., advertising network is, and how we can use that to support public infrastructure for social media and hopefully other things as well.
Well, certainly, as the operator of as independent as I can make it, a Hearsay Culture Media and the Hearsay Culture Network, I have intentionally built it this way, where I am trying to not connect with infrastructures that could impact my journalistic integrity and the topics that I pick. I mean, some people find it, surprising that this show has been on KZSU-FM Stanford since 2006, right? Going up on almost 20 years. I have regularly criticized the many players in Silicon Valley for starting with Facebook and Google and others for lack of transparency and so forth. Even though, right, I don't know about Facebook, I should be clear, but certainly Google has been a benefactor of many of the projects that Stanford has. And of course, then those that want to view that completely nefariously, which it hardly is, right, have tried to vilify those who take private money to do public good. And here we are again and again and again. And by the way, I should note, right, Stanford has its own resources, to put it mildly. So, how am I able to do that, right? I'm able to do that because I share the show with KZSU, and I'm proud of that affiliation, and I'll continue to do it as long as more or less KZSU operates the way it does, and KZSU wants it, and I'm able to do it, and so I'm very proud of it. But I also, and this is kind of my point, I'm also doing this because I have another source of income. Right. I mean, I am paid by Elon University, right? And this, Hearsay Culture operates in tandem with my scholarly work and my teaching. I teach internet law, I write in this space and so forth. So, it's well in line. But, right, Elon doesn't pay me to do Hearsay Culture. Elon pays me to teach contracts, which I am doing now for over 50 first-year law students, to do my writing, to be the academic dean for faculty development, and so forth and so forth. In other words, I can afford to do this. Now, I do, to be clear, and Hearsay Culture listeners know, I do want to make it profitable. I'd like to, much in the way you're describing, come up with ways for independent journalism to operate in this space on its own. And so my ears, although they're now covered by headphones, perked up when you said a public interest advertising network, which I would love to talk to you more about, both off air as well as on air. But that I think is a topic for a completely different show, although it's closely related. So let's talk about, right, in the 13 or 14 minutes that we have left, what feed our feeds can do. So I think we've identified a big part of the problem, right? But now let's talk about solutions. So you have a foundation that's formed. Your website says the foundation itself probably won't launch for months, right, as you get going. So what are you doing now, and what do you see as how this platform, right, supporting public infrastructure will develop through Feed Our Feeds?
So essentially, right now we're in fundraising mode. So and almost entirely everything we're doing at the moment is to raise funds so that we can actually launch this foundation with sufficient money. I think one thing that people don't realize fully is how expensive this digital infrastructure is, because it has been captured by these companies that use the data, use it to push advertising, use it to back their own private interests. It's all become like sort of like this fuzzy thing that can't really be that expensive, but it really is, right? So if you look at the budget for something that's fully independent, like Signal, and Signal is in just a chat program. The budget for Signal, the annual budget for Signal is $50 million, right? And so, which is quite a lot, but if you do the math, if you've operated any kind of system at scale and you try to do the math, it adds up. Like it's not like Meredith Whittaker, who's current president of Signal, is getting a massive salary and living a life of luxury. No, they're running very lean on that 50 million. And so essentially, we need to have enough money to get started. Otherwise, it's not worth doing. Just to be absolutely clear, this is not something where you can go small and hope to like be extremely scrappy. I think even by being scrappy, which we intend to be, it will require multiple millions. So really, again, I'm repeating this, but like the current focus is on fundraising. Once we have the funds, then yes, we will launch the foundation. And the first thing that we want to do is to start operating independent infrastructure. It really is to start focusing on having alternatives to Bluesky so that, again, it serves as checks and balances to keep them honest. So that's essentially the first step. The second step is we want to really support the current Bluesky engineers and join and help in ensuring public governance of the protocol definition itself. So the technology, be it the open source code or the specs that define how the protocol works, are things that need to be shepherded through a standards process, probably the IETF, but perhaps a multi-pronged approach. And that is something that we will definitely support directly, because we need to make sure that these protocols are remain in the public interest and are publicly maintained. And then once we've launched these two initiatives, we want to use the remaining funds and ideally a funding pipeline in order to support backing any number of existing or new projects out there that require funding. And this could be a lot of different things, right? It could be, as I mentioned before, perhaps we should be investigating a public interest advertising network. And that is something that would support sustainability of the entire ecosystem. So that's one thing we could be looking into. I'm not committing to anything because it's not my personal decision, right? But
Yeah.
these are things I want to explore. I want to also look into supporting different feeds. So as you know, Bluesky and the app protocol in general supports algorithmic plurality so that you can have a great diversity of feeds, not just the one that one person decided upon. And there's some really interesting one like the news, actually news media feed, for instance. There's this project called Black Sky that has its whole universe of feeds and content moderation, etc. Those are the kinds of things that I want to see prosper, and that I really want to see the foundation being able to back. And again, the idea is to like back these things and figure out ways of helping them become sustainable, so that we can grow this ecosystem with many players that fulfill different functions and bring different value and provide checks and balances for one another.
A lot of, and we're chatting with Robin Berjon on KZSU-FM Stanford and the Hearsay Culture Network and Hearsay Culture Media. A lot of what we're facing, therefore, as we start closing our discussion today, right? It's about funding, it's about values, and it's also about how we begin these projects. It shouldn't be lost on listeners or anyone, right, that the internet was funded by governments, right? And so the value, literally, right, the values, although it was started by the U.S. Department of Defense, right, it was started in conjunction with and in partnership with public institutions and educational institutions like Stanford, right? The values inherent in building the internet were very much about open protocols and extensibility, right? And the ability of anyone to join the network without permission, right? And do what it is that they want to do. It's that very extensibility, of course, that allowed the giant behemoths to take over in a lot of ways. And so countering that is in part about the values, but the values are already baked in, aren't they? In social media and in these platforms. In other words, even if we have public governance, right? Even if we have the ideal that you describe, aren't we still fighting an uphill battle in terms of what social media is and what people expect it to be, as opposed to how the internet was launched?
I I don't know that I agree with that. I think there's hope. I think there's really hope. I really believe that one of the things that has harmed social media very seriously today in the form that it has taken is really the fact the absence of pluralism itself, right? Everyone, you have, two, three, four platforms that actually matter, and everyone on those platforms has to abide by the choices of one single recommendation algorithm, just the one, right? And if you think of that in social terms, in like traditional media terms, it's exactly like having just one newspaper or just one TV channel, right? You're going to get a distorted perspective on reality, and you're going to get distorted optimizations for how people interact with one another. If you take that world and you replace it with a world in which there's a great diversity of interaction modalities and there's a great diversity of recommendation algorithms, and people see different things in the way that match their preferences, such also that they can choose their own content moderation and not have to see trolls or not have to see harassers, even though Facebook likes to keep them on because it's good for their bottom line. In this case, if you choose yourself, then you're not going to choose to see them, right? And so if we reintroduce this diversity, which is something that I've written about with Maria Farrell earlier last year, called Rewilding the Internet, then if you have this diversity, then you change behaviors, because with different people, not all like in following one single optimization path, but everyone following, their own agency and their own preferences, I think you get a diversity of behaviors that is much healthier and less likely to be about, harassment and hate and polarization and all the things that have been happening on social media.
Robin, I want to get your opinion on this recent trend, right, of the exodus or exodus is too strong. The exodus by some from Facebook because of the lack of fact checking. And look, I mean, people are struggling with this. Although I want to be absolutely clear, right? There's struggles involving, what social media platform I should be on, and there's struggles involving where am I going to get my next meal. So I don't want to over dramatize this as a struggle. There are real struggles, and then there are kind of struggles that some people are privileged and fortunate enough to have to be able to debate. So I want to put aside for a moment one of the arguments about this, which is that some people cannot afford to leave Facebook or other social media platforms because it's their community and they need it that way. I mean, I'll for example, I know a few people who are involved in very intimate discussions of long COVID, and have found Facebook's, and many social benefits more valuable and important, and they're not going to leave. So I want to put that aside for the moment and talk about this from the concept of changing how the platform operates. What's your opinion of not of the people, but of the decision to leave Facebook as a way to address, right, your, as a user, right, consternation and concerns about how it operates, and as a tool of impacting how social media companies operate themselves? Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some people try to stay on these social media in the hope that by being there they can sort of shift things. But the thing is, like, you really can't beat the algorithm, right? You're in a system that is entirely constrained and in which interactions are, very closely policed by the algorithm, by what becomes surfaced as relevant. And I don't think that staying, again, as you said, assuming you can leave, I don't think that staying achieves anything. If it were like a physical, public square, that would be different, right? You could stay on the public square and by your very presence push back on whatever direction might be imposed on the conversation there. But within an algorithmic system, you really can't. If we look at the earlier Twitter exodus, um, a few weeks after Elon Musk took Twitter over, my reach there just like simply vanished. I had something like 10,000 followers. Basically, any considered post I made would have like any number of retweets and likes and discussion and shares like that. And overnight, it went from something that was very lively to me to an absolute dead town. And the reason for that is simply because the algorithm decided that me and other people like myself shouldn't have reach, shouldn't have voice. And staying there and talking to no one because no one sees what you say, so serves no purpose at all. So I absolutely encourage people who can to leave. I know that there aren't really options for everyone just yet. So, for instance, the people who like Instagram are still looking for the alternative. I know that I've heard rumors, I haven't actually seen the thing, that there is a Bluesky based, so a NAT protocol based alternative to Instagram called Flashes that's about to launch next week or the week after.
Hmm.
So I think that is something that's happening, but I really encourage people to leave and to move to new places. Now,
A
in
little breaking
considering which,
news here, by the way.
sorry.
I said a little breaking news there. Flashes. I hadn't heard about that. So interesting to hear.
I'm definitely looking forward to it. I mean, I'm not a big Instagram user myself, but I've over the past few weeks I've had dozens of people reach out and say, like, I mean, I love Instagram, but I hate Zuckerberg. I need to go somewhere. Where should I go? So hopefully that is something that will materialize soon. But what I would encourage people to consider as they make those moves is to look towards platforms where that might be the last move that they have to make. Moving from a social platform to another is extremely disruptive. I've been on the internet for like almost, I mean, yeah, for about 30 years, and I've done it many times. But you lose your network, you lose your former content, you lose a lot when you move. With the ad protocol, one thing that's great is that it supports a property called credible exit, which means that you can always take your followers and your data and everything else that you've accumulated there. And so that is, in my mind, a big step forward, such that if tomorrow Bluesky becomes bad, and that's also why we're building this countervailing power there, right? If Bluesky becomes bad, then I can just take my stuff and leave without all the disruption. I think that's a great step forward.
Robin, the project is Feed Our Feeds.
Free our feeds, free our
Yeah.
feeds. Sorry.
There we go. See, there we go. See, I just did the trademark issue that I just mentioned. It's going to be. I'll tell you as an aside. And I think the name is terrific, and it gets to the point. However, what I just did will be perhaps an example when I teach trademark law again. The confusion there. So it is free our feeds, and the website is freeourfeeds.com. In terms of making donations, you can go to the website. Is there anything else that where listeners can find more information about the project?
Right now, not yet, but we're going to keep publishing about it, keep writing about it, and keep giving interviews about it with such great, places as yourself.
Thank you. Robin Berjon, joining us from Belgium. Thank you. And by the way, incidentally, by an infrastructure which is terrific, right? And really, I mean, thank God we have it. Zoom and video conferencing has made it possible for us to do these kinds of high quality discussions. Grateful for you to be here. Much luck and much success with Free Our Feeds. And thank you for joining us today on Hearsay Culture.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
Hearsay Culture Network, right, can be found at hearsayculture.com, where you can find out more about our project and our shows, and to join, which allows you to have more access and more content. Although speaking of this topic, and most of what we do will be free, as a way to help the world understand better what this technology does and how business, culture, and technology interact. So you can check out more at hearsayculture.com. Otherwise, please stay tuned to KZSU for more diverse programming, and have a great day.